you. Thanks for coming to this discussion of the birds. We're happy as always to see you. Well, I guess I technically don't see you, but to see your names and to hear from you and hear your thoughts about the week's movie. It was pointed out to me by one of our regulars, Richard Hirsh, that there was kind of a pattern going that last week was cats, this week is birds. And he sent me a link to a clip for a movie about menacing worms, which would be the next logical movie to choose in the food chain of horror. But don't worry, we're not doing that. I'm not going to tell you what next week's movie is, but it will not be about worms. And it's actually not a scary movie either. In case you are new to our little get together here, please keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question or making a comment. You will know it's your turn to ask a question or make a comment because I will call on you. How will I know to call on you? Because you'll use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you can remember to lower your hand once you have asked your question or made your comment, that would be great. You can also introduce yourself in the chat window, make comments you want to share with the other participants. And if you are from outside of the greater Philadelphia area, we would love to know that. So please feel free to say who you are in general terms and where you're watching and participating from. And if you have some thoughts you'd like to share, or you just want to really make sure we know that you're checking in from somewhere far away, please visit our website and go to the Where in the World section, because it's a page actually where you can let us know where you're from and give us some feedback on our programs. We would love to hear it. And with that, I think we can see about getting started. I see some of our regulars are off and running. David, let's start with you.
Okay, that would be very unusual for me to start off. I enjoyed your preface film, but I wanted to go into one or two things. I know you talked a little bit about the technique. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the various ways that they incorporated the real and the fake and the robotic birds. I had been looking at it and trying to parse it without getting myself too distracted. You gave some indication that you may have a lot of the technical information. I'm hoping you do. I hope everybody noticed Mr. Hitchcock walking through the first, 1 or 2 minutes into the movie, as he almost always, if not always, does.
Oh gosh, what happened? I think I just muted you by mistake there. David, I'm sorry. Okay, you're back. Sorry about that. That was my mistake.
I don't know where you lost me.
That was my mistake. Sorry.
No, I don't know where to start over.
Oh no, we heard you that you had just finished pointing out Hitchcock's cameo.
Okay, good. And so the one question, and I don't usually do much that's negative, and it's not really negative, it's part of Hitchcock. At the end, they ride off. They make a big point of bringing the bird cage into the car, and without saying any more, nothing happens at the end that sort of resolves. And somewhat that's Hitchcock. And I kept thinking that bird cage was part of the magnet for the birds, and that they were trying to free the bird, the mass of birds were trying to free the birds from the bird shop and from the cage. And anything that you can do to elucidate or tell us you can't would be greatly appreciated. You've now more than doubled my Hitchcock movies I've seen. I used to be too scared to watch them, and you've made me brave.
Well, I'm glad to hear it, David. And there's a lot more to enjoy. Not all so scary as this one. But let me see if I can think about responding to your points. The effects, the technology. So this movie, because there was a combination of location shooting and set shooting and thank you. Please remember to keep yourselves muted. There was a combination of location shooting and set shooting to achieve different visual effects. They use a combination of real birds, fake or stuffed, birds, animated birds, and of birds captured via a technology that sort of combines live action and animation called rotoscoping, which was really only being done at that point by Disney. You may have noticed in the credits there was a special visual consultant credit or words to that effect for a man named UB Iwerks, who was really Walt Disney's right-hand man, and a lot of people would tell you the unsung genius of Disney decades. But in any case, that Disney was the company that had the ability to do that sort of hybrid process known as rotoscoping, because if you notice in movies like Snow White, some of the movement, particularly of Snow White when she's dancing and things like that, is very much fluid movement, reminiscent of how a person would actually move, more so than sort of the hand drawing of a person moving. And it's very complicated, and I don't know all the details off the top of my head. I could read the notes I have on the process, but it involves sodium vapor lights and all sorts of things that are too in depth for this venue. But suffice it to say, there was traditional animation, and you could see that sort of when you saw the bare silhouettes of some birds in the really crowded scenes. That was combined with live action with that rotoscoping process. And real birds and fake birds. In addition to that, there were a lot of matte paintings used, which is an elaborate painting of a background, or typically, I should say, a background in the distance, often done on a glass plate that is then sort of put in front of the camera and that blocks off part of the frame. So the camera's capturing live action in front of it in the lower third of the plane of the frame, let's say, and the top third is occupied by that matte painting, which has been painted at just the right perspective and scale to mimic what would be in the distance of the shot. So those are some of the techniques that were employed. And that last shot that Hitchcock commented on as being his most challenging of his career combines virtually all of those elements. I don't know that there was any actual, I don't know there was rotoscoping in that one now that I think about it, but you had a matte painting, you had location footage, you had what I think had to have been set footage in the foreground, and then you had the various types of birds. So that's why that shot at the end was so challenging to him. Regarding the conclusion of the film, and I think this is a really, big sort of point that, hopefully a number of you have things to say about it. I frankly don't think those are in any way directly related to the cause of the bird attacks. I think the lovebirds are a MacGuffin. They're the reason why, the excuse for Melanie Daniels to go to Bodega Bay in the first place, to deliver those lovebirds. I don't think the birds are attacking the town in some sort of, Planet of the Apes or Planet of the Birds solidarity movement to free those birds that are currently caged by humans. I think the attack of the birds is either a kind of supernatural or extra natural phenomenon, or it is related to one of possibly two flawed female emotions in the film. Again, that's as the film sees it, not as I see it. Either Melanie Daniels' abnormal desire for Mitch, or Lydia, Jessica Tandy's unnatural desire for Mitch. And I think that you notice that at the end of the film, when they get into the car, finally, Lydia has warmth and affection and caring for Melanie, though seemingly she hasn't had it for her own daughter all along, but that's another point. And I think that the combination, I think the birds being calm and they're being able to, the group of people being able to leave the area safely relates to the fact that Melanie has finally gained that acceptance or come to that understanding with Lydia. But it's just one theory. I do think that the movie is sort of, you know, not satisfying in the way that it doesn't offer a clear end. But one has to wonder if perhaps Hitchcock was stinging from the criticism from his last film, the end of his last film, Psycho, which had a very, very all too pat and neat ending. In fact, it's what a lot of people dislike most about the movie, when a psychiatrist appears at the police station and sort of explains everything about everything that had happened and all the sort of mental and psychological intricacies that explained every aspect of the actions and behavior. And so I think Hitchcock sort of went in the opposite direction here, and maybe he swung the pendulum too far that way. But I have talked for far too long, so long, in fact, that I see all the hands that had been up before. Did they go away? Oh, no, they didn't. Thank goodness. All right. Let's go to Robert.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Thanks. I just make a couple of points. The most extraordinary thing about this movie for me was there was not one note of music, not one. I don't know about all of you. I have never seen a movie with absolutely no music. I thought that was extraordinary. And instead of music, the sounds were, what did we have? Well, we had the flapping of the wings, but sometimes the wings were of different pitches. I think you pointed this out in your introduction. So you had variations on the sounds of the wings. Then you had the cawing of the birds. And what I loved most was silence. I've never seen a film like this. There was silence when the mother, Lydia, went to find the dead body of the poor guy whose eyes were, all messed up. She comes out and screams, but nothing comes out of her mouth. Silence. And then the extraordinary scene, which Richard Chaitt just pointed out in the chat. There's an extraordinary scene where, what's her name again? Melanie was outside the schoolhouse waiting for the kids. I think there's about 50 feet of film, at least 30 seconds or more, with silence. And I found, and you're wondering what, and then as the silence is there, and in the background, the birds are gathering on that structure there, the jungle gym.
Jungle gym, yeah.
I just thought, I've never seen, and somebody said, yes, this film is held up. I think this is, anyway, I was also bold. I also felt like this was a sort of a typical monster movie, really. I mean, it's where you start out with a group of characters. They all have their problems. They're not getting along. There's a love triangle, and there's a lot of problems. And then there's an outside monster coming in, and they have to come together to fight the monster. And that's what happened in this movie. And as a result, you have people changing inside. Lydia changed, and so did the icy blonde character. She changed as a person throughout this movie, and so did the mother. And as a result of coming together to fight against the monster that's attacking, which is a theme in many, I think, of these horror movies. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert, you're absolutely right. That is a theme in many horror movies. It's also a theme in movies of other genres and as well. I mean, if you think about it to an extent, what is a Western? Not all Westerns, but a lot of Westerns are the people in the town or the people who are making their way out across the frontier or the people in the stagecoach. Who have their differences and disagreements and their hierarchy have to come together against this outside enemy, right? So it's a very common storytelling technique, and I don't say that to dismiss the comment. It's a very thoughtful comment and one that really gets to the heart of a lot of Hollywood filmmaking at any rate. And I think that it was very thoughtful for that reason. Regarding the question of silence, I think you're right. I think this movie uses quiet very effectively, in part because we get conditioned over time, over the course of the movie, to think of quiet as safe, right? To die down or dissipate, and that means that an attack is ending. They start to listen to the sounds of the birds getting louder, and that means trouble. So the silence is a big part of this film. It is interesting, if you notice in the credits, there are two, unlike electronic tonalities that were used in Forbidden Planet, although in this movie it wasn't done in part for budgetary reasons. You also notice that one of Hitchcock's collaborators, Bernard Herrmann, the great composer, was the sound consultant. So there were the sounds that you suggested, but a lot of the squawking sounds and other sounds were sort of constructed again to sort of walk that line between music and noise. I think much more over the line into noise than closer to music, the way Hitchcock had done during the famous shower scene, for example, in Psycho. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Well, I could go on for a while, but I won't.
Thank you.
Uh, Robert had already brought up the issue of the sound. The sound structure was wonderful in this. And I also noticed the credit for Bernard Herrmann at the beginning, and I noticed it said sound consultant. I said, gee, what's that about? You've somewhat explained that. I'm just not clear what he did. I had a couple of comments about your introduction and the Hitchcock's status as an auteur, and I wonder how much did the Truffaut interviews contribute to that? Truffaut, from who was with Cahiers du Cinéma and one of the archetypal auteurs of French cinema, did these wonderful interviews with Hitchcock about virtually every one of the movies he had made up until that time, which was, I think, in the late 60s. And then one other comment, just a speculation, if this movie was made today, it would have been an environmental screed. That's it.
Okay, well, thanks, Joss. Yeah, I mean, certainly the Hitchcock Truffaut book had a lot to do with cementing Hitchcock's reputation as an auteur, but I don't think that book came out till right around the time that this movie came out. And Hitchcock's reputation by that point had already been largely set, particularly in Hollywood. So I think it helped cement that. And I think that, obviously, as I mentioned in the introduction, the critics of Cahiers du Cinéma, including Truffaut and some of his peers, had a lot to do with helping to sort of start that, to start that reputation. And then obviously the interviews later on would bolster it, sort of in a way that, Peter Bogdanovich's interviews with Orson Welles, I won't say bolstered his reputation, but reminded more contemporary Hollywood of his reputation. Bernard Herrmann was brought in because there's really sort of there's at least two major elements to making a soundtrack or composing background effects, if not music, for a film, which one is what what is a fitting sound or what is fitting music for a given moment. But the other is, how do you time it? Where do you place it? What needs music? What doesn't, etc. And, I think Herman was there to help those two technicians who were more experienced with the electronic side of things than the film score side of things. Finally, to your point, absolutely, about this being an environmentally themed film. We've sort of, those tend not to be horror films, but we've had them in recent years. They tend to be disaster movies, with there's a cataclysm that is going to occur, and there's a cast of hundreds, and every natural disaster can cause ripple natural disasters, and so you get to have a big, sort of old 70s fashioned disaster movie where there's floods and earthquakes and tsunamis and ice ages all in one because of whatever the extra the science fiction based natural disaster is. But I think you're right, that element of it, the environmental element of it, which isn't really put into play in this movie, definitely would have been a big part of it if it were made decades later. Absolutely. Richard, you have a question or comment?
Me? Are you talking to me?
Yes, you, Richard.
Okay. No, I
yes,
made
Richard,
all my,
go ahead.
Okay, I made all my, I'm not doing an impersonation of De Niro in Taxi Driver, but all my comments I've put on the chat. And the one thing that occurred to me a year later when Marnie came out, I wanted to see it because I was a big Sean Connery fan, although it's a totally different role. But how amateurish certain scenes were in Marnie, especially the street scene of the house with the boats behind it. And I was only like 17, 18 years old, so I wasn't very sophisticated. And the only scene I felt was the same way in The Birds was when Rod Taylor and Tippi Hedren were on the hill overlooking the birthday party with the backdrop. It looked so artificial.
Was that scene, the dialogue scene between them was on a set, and it was sort of inserted into that larger sequence taking place that was mostly shot on location, and that's something you see in a lot of movies of the era, and something that Hitchcock does. You see in a lot of his movies as well, and it's really a function of the technology of the time, and how they're going to have to do, they imagine, I don't know for a fact, but the sort of more mature, intimate, emotional, serious parts of the movie, the conversations between the characters, and that one was one where they really sort of go into some background and emotional depth with Melanie and her mother and all that. Those are complicated enough to shoot from a sort of actor, director, performance point of view, that you don't need the added challenge of having to worry about everything on location, the changing light on location as you shoot that over the course of multiple days, but it's really supposed to take place over 10 minutes. So that was a pretty common technique, and I completely agree that it's a bit odd that, given how convincing so many of the other effects were, that was done seemingly the way it had been done to that point for decades, and it was a little short of the rest of the aesthetic of the film. I would agree with you on that. Barbara and Richard, you have a question or comment?
Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
I see Judith's name on the screen. Okay.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Well, which one of us do you want, Andrew?
Barbara and Richard, please go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear. Thank you. And the two comments. I seem to recall, I don't have the book any longer, the Truffaut interviews, where the scene at the gas station is one where the camera, pulls back higher and higher and higher. And to the comments about sound, As I recall, the sound also diminishes as the camera pulls higher and higher. So there's this real sense of remoteness. And I think Hitchcock and Truffaut talk about that as this kind of like, this distant idea of God, like sort of like looking down from way up above, but like so remote from what people are doing. So it made me think of the biblical image, some resonances of biblical imagery throughout the movie, including, the woman in the cafe who's, or the person who's always predicting it's the end of the world. So there's always that, but especially the ending. The ending for me evokes some images of like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like there's, the question for me in the movie is always whether it's humanity at large that's being visited by this plague, or whether it's something specific to Bodega Bay. And when they get away in the car at the end, it feels to me like it's almost something specific to this. And these guys are going to escape, and they're going to somehow manage to like get outside of this orbit. So it just seemed to me that there was some kind of apocalyptic imagery, but also, if I remember Hitchcock and Truffaut correctly, Hitchcock sensed that he didn't believe in that kind of a deity that would intervene in that way, that we were kind of on our own. And when these things happen in the world, this randomness and vulnerability, there's nothing to do except to pull back and look at it happening.
Well, you make a couple of very interesting points in those comments. I will start with the second part first. The question of, the apocalyptic sort of, elements of this, and the question of whether it's sort of apocalyptic in a biblical sense. I do think that, it doesn't surprise me to hear you describe Hitchcock's view of religion or of God. But at the same time, I think if we all can picture that final shot of the film that is framed in such a way to give us an opportunity to see a whole lot of sky, it's the sky that has some clouds with areas of light and a sort of shaft of light shining down, and that sort of, historically, and I mean in centuries past, was used in painting sometimes to represent some sort of religious or spiritual elements. So I think there's something to that. I think the film makes it clear that this is only primarily happening in Bodega Bay. They mention that, something minor in Santa Rosa, but that it is specific. And I think it's difficult. I don't think Hitchcock, based on his sort of track record of being interested in people and their behavior and the consequences and order versus chaos and humans' ability to change or not change their nature and things like that. I don't think he would be so interested, even though he is talking about humans at large. I don't think he's interested in telling stories about things that affect all people. I think he's interested in particular scenarios and particular situations and particular characters who, because of the way they are, happen to them, or they have these problems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those people are stand-ins for all of us who have similar or may have similar, elements to our personalities. And that was the part that, made the film so widely appealing and applicable. But I don't think this was any sort of, wrath on the whole planet or even the whole country or anything like that. I think this was about those people. The other point you made in the beginning of your statement, I had something else to say about that, but I'm drawing a blank on what that was.
That was about the camera pulling back at the
Oh,
gas
yes.
station scene and the sound diminishing at the same time.
Thank you. It's not actually, if you watch the film, it's not the camera pulling back. It is a cut after the destruction of the gas station and all that stuff and the fire and everything. It's a cut to a very, very, very high overhead shot where at first it is quiet, and what you see is the sort of outline, the sort of flame path at a tremendous distance. You are very high up and you see that. And that was done again, I don't think of it as a God's eye view, although I'm not going to argue with Hitchcock or Truffaut, who actually spoke to him, something I never did. I think of it more of as a bird's eye view, because what we see there is, first we see that shot sort of unimpeded, but then some birds start to float into the frame, and then some sound starts to return. We hear some of their squawks. So it's sort of a coda at the end of that, that chaotic scene with the fire and the explosion. And I sort of think it's a punctuation kind of, and I think it's sort of saying, I always thought it was saying, that's sort of the bird saying, that'll show you to mess with us, sort of thing. I tend not to think of, of God entering into Hitchcock's movies, but maybe that's not fair of me. I think there's clearly elements of his worldview that were influenced by his strict Roman Catholic upbringing, but I tend not to think of God himself having any impact on the movies, but that's just my opinion. Let's see, Frank, you have a question or comment?
Hi there. This is actually Dorothy. It's Dorothy and Frank.
Hi, Dorothy.
We were captivated by the song that the children were singing in the schoolhouse, conducted by Annie, as Melanie nervously waited outside in the playground to speak to Annie and bring Kathy home at Lydia's request. And we looked it up, and it is a song that the lyrics were rewritten slightly. It's based on a Scottish folk song called Risseldy Rosseldy. And it's about a cooper's wife who is not behaving like a wife is supposed to behave. She won't wash, she won't clean, she won't card the wool. And eventually he gets fed up with her and puts a sheepskin on her back and beats her. And so we began to think that this film was a comment on what would have been perceived at that time as overly aggressive women like Melanie, and that there was some retribution being paid for that sort of breach of decorum at the time. And I wondered what your thoughts were on this.
Yes, I think that is there are a number of reasons, and I hadn't done the research into that song, and I appreciate that you did and you shared it with all of us. I hadn't done the research into the song, but aside, even without that knowledge, yes, I think there is definitely a way to read this film as what is occurring is a result of Melanie's unhealthy desire for Mitch and the lengths she's willing to go to act on it. I think it's actually, I think there's a way to read. I think that it's more likely that that's the dominant or most accessible reading of the film, more so than the fact that what's occurring is a result of Lydia's, inappropriate feelings for her own son. Because as that woman says to Melanie in the diner, that woman, we sort of get that direct address of that woman walking towards Melanie, and the camera standing in for Melanie, and she says, "You did this started when you got here," and Melanie slaps her. And I think that there's a strong case to be made for that, because if you take away all the bird stuff, I know that's a funny thing to say in a movie called The Birds, but if you take away all the bird stuff, I mean, what is this? This is a movie about a woman wanting a man. And I won't say the world's not okay with it, but certainly her mother's not okay with it. His mother's not okay with it. And when you see what movies like this, which are often, the sort of a very popular trope of Hollywood melodrama from certainly the late 30s through the 50s, this fits into one of those films. And there are movies, one of my favorites of that period that jumps out to me as being comparable is Humoresque, where a female character has the ability and the means and the drive and the desire and acts on it for a man. and has to be punished for it. And I think it's very, very interesting that at the end of the film, when they all get into the little car, that finally Lydia is able to be caring and warm and welcoming to Melanie. And what has changed, except that Melanie subjected herself to a brutal and violent physical attack, that she paid her dues, so to speak, and now Lydia was willing to welcome her into the family. Sort of a much rougher, nastier version of the way Grace Kelly puts herself in danger in Rear Window, and then Jimmy Stewart's character has a sort of newfound respect for her and feels more comfortable settling down with her. One of the hallmarks of Hitchcock's films is that blonde women are put through the ringer, and the icier, the more self-possessed, the more driven, the more confident, the more assertive, the more they get punished. And that's what happens in this film. And I think that there's a lot to the reading that one would naturally derive from your comment. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Reena, you have a question or comment?
Yes, there were two things that impressed me in the film. One of them was the beauty of the way some of the scenes were constructed. And I guess I never thought of Hitchcock as, being a beautiful.
Reena, are you there?
Yeah.
Reena, what when you say beautiful, what sort of thing are you talking about?
Okay, so in particular, there was one scene where Melanie has her arms around Kathy, and Melanie's is wearing that green suit, and Kathy has some yellow, and the scenery behind is green and yellow, and there were, and Melanie's hair is blonde, and there were several scenes where the juxtaposition of the colors I thought was just exquisite, and that's not what I think of when I think of Hitchcock. So that was one thing. And the other thing, maybe it's too obvious to even mention, but I just thought the scene in the diner was really brilliant, because it just showed the different ways that human beings try to cope with the unexpected and the life-threatening. And it reminded me of, I don't know if he was making any references to World War II or anything like that, but you've got the British woman who's being all intellectual about it, and she's giving you these facts and figures and what birds do and don't do. And then there was a policeman who was looking at it from sort of a public, order sort of perspective. And then there was the guy who was thinking, oh, for sure, this is the end of the world, and bringing the biblical quotes. There's the woman who wanted to escape as fast as she could and protect her children. And then there's the man who just has to wait to have one more drink before he sets out, no matter how dangerous it is. He has a reason to stay put. And those were, different strategies that people had to cope with this unknown threat. And finally, the woman turns on Melanie and tries to make her the scapegoat for everything. And of course, that also happens. So I just thought it was quite brilliant that in such a small space, with not all that amount of time, all those different dynamics were happening, and some of them were happening at the same time, like the two more than one conversation at once.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, Reena. I appreciate your making them. I think regarding the first point about Hitchcock and the color and the beauty of the shots, I think Hitchcock hadn't done that many films in color, and so I think that was what sort of limited his palette, so to speak. He certainly did some. I also think he hadn't done any movies that relied on location shooting so much. And I'm sure that partly that was at least an inspiration if it didn't actually facilitate some of the use of color. The last thing I would say is, this was an area of the country where Hitchcock spent a lot of time. There's a reason so many of his movies are set in Northern California, and it's because he had a vacation home up there and spent a lot of time in that area. So perhaps it was, he had a personal investment in sort of, either a personal fondness for the beauty of the area or a familiarity with it that facilitated that. But I think you're right. This is a very good use of color from a filmmaker we don't typically think of as doing that. To your second point, I don't think it's too obvious to mention. In fact, you helped bring another great example to what Robert was talking about at the beginning of the discussion, which was the movie Lifeboat, right? Which is set during war and is about different people dealing with the situation, the very difficult situation they're in differently, and looking for a scapegoat and all of those things. And that's that scene, even though it's a sort of break in the action and the terror, is a very effective scene because, as you said, there's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different ideas brought up in a relatively short period of time in what to me is a pretty, it doesn't seem very heavy-handed, right? It's a diner. There will be different people in there, people from different walks of life, and they have different opinions, and it makes total sense. And it's a way to put a lot of interesting ideas out there. So I think that's worth noting as well. Thanks, Reena. Let's see. Mark, you had a question or comment.
A couple of comments. First, the first bird attack happens the week before she arrives. Remember the fishing boat. So I don't think you can attribute all of it to the arrival of. It's not the week before. Yeah, he says last week I had a fishing boat attack.
Oh yeah.
And second, having just read one of William Goldman's books, I think if we're talking about the color palette, we should give a little credit to the cinematographer. Hitchcock didn't stand behind the camera and shoot it. And the last point was that the scene in the phone booth was very reminiscent to me of Psycho and the shower scene.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point of comparison, the phone booth and the shower. Of course, in a sense, the phone booth shields her, saves her, at least for a time, but it's a place where we don't think of being exposed to or having to experience anything horrific, just like the shower. And of course, that is what happens. Regarding what you said about the cinematographer, absolutely. We all tend to fall into a trap of giving the director credit for things that we should sometimes credit the cinematographer for, though in this case, knowing what I know about Hitchcock and how he basically sort of how meticulous he was about storyboarding, how meticulous he was about things like his leading lady's costumes. I do think that we can give him a fair amount of the credit, but the fact that we notice those color similarities and differences, and that things are lit and framed in such a way as to make them evident is definitely a point of credit to the cinematographer. Absolutely. Let's see. Everybody we have here has asked a question before. So, nope, yes, no, okay. So let's go back to Richard. You had another comment? Richard Chaitt, you had another comment?
Yeah, well, it was just a joke here. They could not do the scene in the phone booth today because there are no phone booths, and having a cell phone protect the character wouldn't cut it.
Right. Absolutely. That was a very time specific. In fact, you could imagine, right? I can imagine in 10 years, I'll show this movie to my son and he'll say, what's that thing that lady went into? And then I will, at that moment, get a lot, even more gray hairs. Absolutely. Joss, you had another comment.
Comment/question.
Sure.
There was some really wonderful, that just focusing on that scene, those scenes in the diner, and the characters and the dialogue and the situations and the relationships. there was a lot of writing going on here. How much did Hitchcock influence the screenplay? Because he doesn't get the credit for it.
Right. So Hitchcock would not have been interested in certainly not in the specifics of the dialogue. Sometimes he worked with people sometimes he had people write the screenplays or be involved in the writing of the screenplays that were people who had worked with him for a long time. Sometimes they were people who were not particularly known screenwriters. That's not the case here. The screenplay was written by Evan Hunter, who was a novelist and screenwriter of some repute. I didn't double check this before we came on, but I'm pretty sure he wrote the novel on which Blackboard Jungle was based. And I know that he'd written other novels that were turned into films and had written other screenplays. So he benefited here and benefited in that scene. I would bet dollars to donuts that the things that we all appreciate and we've been talking about in that scene, the credit would go to Evan Hunter. Hitchcock was involved in the screenplay, crafting of the screenplay of all his movies, but in a more macro sense, a more structural sense, we need to have a scene where this sort of thing happens and that sort of thing happens, not in sort of on a dialogue level. And I think he probably, I think the credit for that probably should go to the screenwriter Evan Hunter more than Hitchcock himself. Although we can give Hitchcock some credit for leaving in such an extended, pause in the action in such a moment in the film where he's not really able to do anything Hitchcockian, but it makes the film better, as people have been saying. Let's see, Ellen, you have a question or comment? Ellen Rosen, are you there? Okay. Let's see. Oh, go ahead, Ellen. Go ahead.
Okay, here I go. Yeah, someone mentioned earlier about the bird cage being the cause of it, and the birds wanting the caged birds out. This was something I thought, and I interpreted the entire movie by that one idea that these birds were trying to free their fellow caged birds. But it occurs to me now that that's the environmental thing that would be appropriate in our decade, now, in environmentally conscious time. That's more likely to have been Freudian. So I have to watch the whole movie over again. The only thing that made me think I was probably wrong was that when they took the bird cage out, I thought, oh my God, their birds are going to see the bird cage and peck their eyes out, and that's how it's going to end. But no, the birds let the bird cage go. So it probably had nothing to do with the bird cage. So I've got to go back to it now, thinking like I would have in the 60s with Freudian and Oedipal and a whole new way of seeing it. That's all I got.
Thanks for making that point, Ellen. And I think it's a good lesson for all of us, right? That we sometimes, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, we sometimes want to see more that's more in a movie than might be there. And I think that's a fair endeavor with many movies because, just as we're not always conscious of the subtext to what we're saying or doing, filmmakers aren't either. But that being said, things that, really were not part of the culture, what was popular and dominating the culture at the time, what wasn't. And you're absolutely right that Freudianism and psychoanalysis and gender dynamics and things like that were much more at the forefront of the culture than the environment was. So I think that's a good observation. Let's see. Reena, you had another question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one of the other visual images that I thought was very good was the way that her blonde fur coat, the texture of it against her coloring. That was another thing that I thought was really beautiful. And there's something, the other thing I'm just going to add now is that there's something about birds in a cage and birds on the loose. The very first scene is in a pet shop, which is the total opposite of the birds being free. I'm not sure it's an environmental thing from that period. I think it might be something about, how do birds behave in nature? Something about that. I don't know. But in the end, when she says, well, it's not these birds' fault, they're innocent. There's something about, the innocence of the birds as well. So there's something complicated there, I think, with the birds who are in cages and the birds who are out of cages.
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be something there. That there might be something, some sort of statement about freedom versus containment or something like that. Regarding your point about the costume, the costumes credit has to be given to Edith Head. Tippi Hedren's costumes or Melanie Daniels' costumes were all done by Edith Head, who, for those of you who don't know, was the costume designer par excellence in Hollywood from the 40s into the early 80s. She really was, if you saw, particularly in the 40s and 50s and 60s, if you saw a costume in a movie that you loved, there's I'd say even odds that it was an Edith Head costume. In addition, for those of you who are fans of Pixar, the character of Edna in the Incredibles movies was based on or inspired by Edith Head as well. Let's see. Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about the horror element of it. I believe that the actress herself was really frightened of being attacked in some of these scenes, and they were quite brutal, particularly in the house. And let's just discuss that a little bit.
Okay. Yes, you are absolutely right. There are all sorts of stories about the nasty things that Tippi Hedren had to put up with during the making of this film, both in the official course of making this film and in the, I guess, the related situation of being under contract to Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock discovered her in a television commercial and put her under a 7-year contract, and really took an unhealthy interest in her life, in her appearance, in her public appearances. And there are at least allegations, if not more. I'm not familiar with them personally, but I've read secondhand sources that he did things that we would today consider assault against her. But if we can put that aside, serious as it is, if we can put that aside and talk about within the film, Hitchcock was well known for having very little regard for actors, particularly those who were not stars, and those he felt he had discovered or done a great deal to bolster the careers of. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the sort of how he was unwilling to forgive Grace Kelly for sort of quitting acting and going on with her life as a princess. And he took those things personally, and he was very harsh about it. And in the making of this film, he wouldn't be the first or last director to have trouble with boundaries when trying to get a certain look to a shot or a certain response from an actor. And there are lots of stories from the set of live birds being thrown at her, et cetera, and other things that, in the making of the film that most actors wouldn't put up with, and certainly today would never fly, leaving aside even the stuff that is said to have happened off the set as well. So yes, it's a horror film for us, but it certainly seems like it was a horror film for her as well. Judith, you have a question or comment?
Yes, Andrew, first of all, thank you for the very thorough introduction on Hitchcock that you gave us. And I just wanted to comment on the love story aspect. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, the love story aspect, they take it down to the personal, the transformation of Melanie as she develops this relationship with Mitch and how she grows and changes, and all the the psychological impacts, and then sort of overlay that with the story of the birds. And I just wanted, I think the movie is very thematically rich. I think there's so many themes going on. I just wonder if you might comment on how this compares with Rear Window, which you said was Hitchcock was able to integrate the love story and the suspense and all that so beautifully, and that was probably done much better. I'm just wondering what you think about how this was accomplished in The Birds, given that there were so many things going on and it was so complex and complicated.
Yes, well, thank you for the question, Judith, and thank you for the remarks about my introduction. You were very, very nice to use the word thorough instead of excruciatingly long, and I appreciate that. I just start talking, and I have some points I want to make, and I don't know how long. I don't know how long I've been going until I see the rendered video, and I was stunned that it was approaching half an hour. But anyway, thank you.
That's okay.
To your point, I think this movie, it's interesting because it's not as neatly, those elements aren't as neatly integrated, right? The suspense plot and the relationship plot, I think in Rear Window come together, work together sort of seamlessly, in part, I think, because of the nature of the protagonist's limitations in the film. He almost has to sort of, Grace Kelly has to take on some of the tasks that the male protagonist in a movie like that typically would have done because of Stewart character's condition. And in a sense, that sort of, to me, makes the development of their relationship and the development of the suspense plot, adhere together much more tightly. Here, I think it's a very different animal. I don't think this is a suspense film or mystery like that one was. I think it's a horror film, and as such, I think the sort of I think that the heights are higher and the valleys are lower in a sense. I think that the unexplained nature of it, everything in Rear Window had to be explained. That was the nature of it. It was, we've seen this thing, is the reason for it this or is it that? And everything had to be explained in that. In this movie, in a sense, nothing's explained. And I think that it isn't as much about, in fact, it's not really, in a sense, related to, if we're all willing to entertain the readings the most common readings that have sort of come out here, it's not really about Mitch's relationship with Melanie. The birds don't really care about Mitch. They care about Melanie and whether she's behaving appropriately or not. And frankly, even though if we take the Lydia reading that this is related to her unhealthy, fondness for her son or attachment to her son, then that's not really about Mitch either. In a way, it's about the threat posed to her relationship with Mitch. So I don't think it integrates as tightly here, but I think that's in large part a function of it being a horror film versus being a suspense film. The nature of the danger is so much bigger, further afield, et cetera, that to tie things together as closely as in that film, I think would have been impossible. I think it's a genre difference as much as anything else. Let's see, Barbara and Richard, do you have another question or comment?
Yes, it's Barbara this time. Thank you,
Hi.
Andrew. Yeah, I want to go back to the horror element of the film, and I want to add something, which is, first of all, I so appreciate this film for all of the levels, and I hear very much the argument you're making for this being in some ways about women and gender and psychology. I want to wade into the discussion about the environmental piece. That diner scene, which was so rich, I don't know if everyone caught it, but in the course of all of those conversations going on back and forth, somebody ordered fried chicken. And I really appreciated that. And one other thing that was interesting is I watched this movie on a DVD that I borrowed from the library, and it had some bonus tracks. And one of the bonus tracks was an unusual kind of trailer, which had Alfred Hitchcock in a very sophisticated environment. It looked like a library, in which he talked about human relationships to birds. And he said they're so good because we use their plumage to decorate ourselves. He had a shotgun there. He said they're so good for sport. He had a bird in a cage, which he said, you know, they're so good as pets. And then he sat down and then didn't eat a large bird that was cooked at the table. So I think the idea that this is not about the environmental stuff may be a little too hasty. I think as a horror movie, the one of the themes that I took away was that the horror is, just imagine if the tables were turned and the birds treated us like we treat them, and what that would be like in terms of cruelty and terror and disbelief and death. So I, you know, in a film that starts with birds being domesticated in that pet shop, to birds, you know, in that final scene where they seem to be victorious. I see that, at least in my view, at least, it was one of the fun things about the film was the horror of it.
Well, Barbara, you make a very interesting point. I will say also in support of your point that Planet of the Apes came out in 1968, the original did, and that asks, at least implicitly, the question similar to the one you posed, which is what would happen if in that case, monkeys treated us the way we treat monkeys. And I got an email from Ron, who mentioned that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out in 1962, which is before this movie came out. There's something about me, both in response to the fact that Silent Spring had come out before this film and in response to your description of that trailer, there's part of me that thinks, I don't know why, I just don't believe Hitchcock cared about the environment. I don't know why. I have no basis for that other than just a feeling based on what I know from second and third hand sources of his personality. But there have been, you know, Barbara's comments and Ron's point and others certainly make the fair case that we shouldn't totally discount the environmental angle. I think that's very fair. Excuse me. There was a question came up in the chat, and it's something that always comes to my mind every time I see this movie, which is what is with the huge age difference between Mitch and between Mitch and his younger sister, Kathy. And I think that is a good question. I personally would tend to chalk it up to it being the most effective for different elements of the plot. I think it gives them a reason to involve the school teacher. I think it gives them a reason to involve the school. I think if you think about it, it gives Melanie a reason to go up there because the birds are not for Mitch directly, but for the sister. And I think it gives us further pause when contemplating the potential Oedipal issues, because do Lydia, Mitch, and Kathy, when we see them, do they look like a a mother with two children or a husband and wife with a daughter. Similarly, when we see, we because we have Kathy being at the age she is, Melanie's between her and Lydia in an age sense, and we see Melanie in many cases, particularly later in the film, being much more warm and caring and motherly towards Kathy than Lydia is. And so that allows that dynamic to come out as well. And one wonders whether that has to do with the changes that Melanie goes through that leads to Lydia's acceptance of her at the end. So I think it's there for those sorts of, character dynamic and plot reasons. But I don't know for sure. Let's see. Robert, you had, we're almost out of time, so I'll take these last three, but I just would ask people to please be brief. Robert, go ahead.
Okay, just two quick questions. The first is, I read in the Truffaut interviews that Hitchcock used 1,360 shots for this film, which was extremely high because Truffaut comments that occasionally you might get 1,000 shots in a film, and this was particularly high. I was wondering, Andrew, what does that mean that he needed or took 1,360 shots? The second question is, after reading the Truffaut book, my impression is that Hitchcock, he went to Bodega Bay, photographed every single man, woman, and child in Bodega Bay and their clothes and every single building, and that he then reconstructed everything on a set and that there was no location shooting. But now I'm confused and I don't know whether there was really any location shooting. So if you could just address those two.
Sure. There was absolutely location shooting. That's not to say that there weren't sets created based on the actual town to recreate certain things, like the inside of the restaurant, or even maybe it's the outside of the restaurant, the inside or outside of the schoolhouse, etc. But there's clearly location shooting done in the film. You can tell because you can tell the difference. You can tell when something's shot outside. You can tell when a background is real or not, as some people have commented during this discussion. And so there was absolutely location shooting, but I don't doubt that there were elements of the town recreated because some things had to be done on a set at that time. Regarding the point about the shots, I think a lot of that can be attributed to there being so many process shots, meaning that there are so many shots where different things had to be filmed at different times, then layered on top. All those different types of birds, those different layers of birds were sometimes shot separately, particularly when they were animated or rotoscoped. And then those layers of film were laid over one another, sometimes in multiple cases. So I think that would have had something to do with the number of shots. Also, this was a 2-hour movie, which was pretty long for Hitchcock at the time. But I think most of it probably is based on the matter of the effects that were needed and the multiple shots needed for that. Yes, it was Hitchcock's most expensive film to that point, and possibly beyond. I'm not sure about beyond, but definitely to that point. Reena, did you have another question or comment?
Yes, I wanted to push back a little bit on the view of Melanie. I'm not sure how much she really changed. I think rather it's Mitch's view of her that changed, because she talks about all the things she was doing in San Francisco, that, when she came back from Italy and she wanted to have a different kind of life and so forth. And she immediately bonds with Kathy. And it doesn't feel like there's an ulterior motive, like Kathy is begging her to come to her party. And she seems to very much relate to her. So I don't think she was so bad to begin with. I think he had this idea of her. He saw her in court and he was being all moralistic about it. And I just want to add, far be it from me to think that Hitchcock would be, giving us a favorable view of a woman like that. But I think it could be read that way.
Well, I think there are two sort of different, kind of layers to Melanie's character changing, right? There is literally, how do we see her act in certain situations, and does that change over the course of the film? And then there is, how does the film's view of her and her relative goodness or badness or other qualities, her iciness or warmth, whatever, how does the film seem to change its view of that? Now, I think that though she is, I think that she talks about being misunderstood and the inaccuracies in the story about what happened to her in Rome, and it's true that she initially is at least receptive to Kathy's interest in her. I think that she does get warmer over as the film goes on. I think she does get more maternal. I think she does seem more natural when interacting with Kathy, particularly when Kathy is emotional. And I think she gets more comfortable with that. But I also think that your point about her not being as bad as Mitch perhaps thinks from the beginning of the film is absolutely a fair point. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for another great discussion. I do want to mention a few things we have coming up. We have some of our remote classroom seminars coming up. I am offering one on post-World War II American cinema, as you can see on your screen, a week from tomorrow. And then we have others coming up on Ridley Scott's Alien. And we also have one taught by Paul Wright on The Office, which was truly a innovative and important sitcom. And Paul Wright does a great job with these television courses. And then we have a short film course that will be our last seminar of the year on December 8th. Gary Kramer, who is a film critic and goes to lots of film festivals, always finds fascinating short films to talk about. And I'm sure that seminar will be no exception. If you are new to Bryn Mawr Film Institute and our programs, please go to brynmawrfilm.org, check out the Film Studies Online section where you can find a host of things, not the least of which is our archive of all of these past discussions. We've done over 25 of them now, so there's a lot to check out. And the video introductions for each of the movies are linked there as well. So you can really, if there's a classic among that list, you can really learn a lot about them. And there's a whole bunch of other things, the mini lessons in Ask Andrew, so on and so forth. Before we go, we have one of our regular attendees who wanted to make a little announcement. So with that being said, David Glusman, I turn it over to you for a minute.
Thank you, Andrew. This is really for our group. Many of us have been to these Monday night events since March, some of us in April when the pandemic hit and trapped us in. Janice and I have only missed a few since then, and we owe a huge thanks to Bryn Mawr Film Institute and Andrew for the education, the entertainment, and the enjoyment. Janice and I realized after about 3 or so years of membership, we've been to several of the live film courses, and I think we've hit about 25 of these Monday night sessions, how much we get out of Bryn Mawr Film Institute. We've made contributions along the way to support it. With the pandemic still well underway, we've made a few additional donations, and I'm going to sort of put out an ask tonight that, and whether it's tonight or next week, when you're enjoying the Bryn Mawr Film Institute and what it's doing, join Janice and me and go online, send a check. I'll urge all of us who are enjoying it to just make sure we keep our institution going. These are unprecedented times, and Bryn Mawr Film Institute is there for us. And I guess it's just a real quick ask. Let's make sure we're all there for Bryn Mawr Film Institute so that it's there for a lot of years. Thanks for the couple minutes, Andrew.
Thank you, David, very much for making that announcement. We appreciate it. These discussions wouldn't be as engaging as they are without people like you, David, and so many of you who make comments or send in questions or participate via the chat. And that would be great. These discussions also wouldn't be what they are if not for, as many of you know, most weeks I have a co-moderator, and all of our co-moderators who are not staff members of Bryn Mawr Film Institute, which is basically all of my co-moderators except for Jacob, have been donating their time over these months. And that's really been so generous of them, and they are really helping out the Film Institute to try to make sure this place that they love, because it lets them engage with all of you, remains strong through this difficult time. And they've been donating their time, and it's been wonderful of them to do that, just as it's wonderful of all of you to join us, and if you can, to donate as well, as David suggested. So thank you all very much. Sign up for our emails. This Thursday, as usual, there will be an announcement of the film we'll be discussing on Monday, as well as a link to the video introduction for it. So I hope to see you then. And until then, have a great week, and watch some good movies. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.